I'm leaving you for good. You have of no use to me anymore. You will die here.
Are you really gonna do this? Do you really want to leave me like this?
Welcome to Heritage Story, your #1 folktales channel for amazing stories.
The rain hammered against the hospital windows like angry fists as Tunde stuffed his clothes into a black duffel bag, his hands trembling not from guilt but from excitement. Behind him, connected to machines that beeped in a steady rhythm, lay Miriam, his wife of 7 years, unconscious, her once full cheeks now hollow, her smooth dark skin now ashen and pale. The woman who had transformed him from a struggling mechanic with oil-stained hands into the owner of a thriving auto company across Nigeria now looked like a stranger, a burden he could no longer carry. "Are you really doing this?" a nurse whispered from the doorway, her eyes wide with disbelief. Tunde didn't answer. Instead, he zipped the bag with a violent pull and walked toward the door where Chidera waited, young, beautiful, her tight dress clinging to curves that made him forget the vows he'd spoken under white wedding tents. "Let's go," he muttered, and without a backward glance at the dying woman who had given him everything, Tunde abandoned his sick wife in that cold hospital room, convinced she would be dead before morning anyway. If you think this story is already intense, wait until you see what happens when Miriam's billionaire father discovers what Tunde has done. But before we get there, let me take you back to where it all began, because you need to understand just how deeply this betrayal cuts. Miriam Okonkwo wasn't just any woman. She was the only daughter of Chief Okonkwo, a quiet billionaire businessman whose wealth could buy entire neighborhoods in Lagos without making a dent in his account. But money never defined Miriam. While her classmates at the private university drove imported cars and wore designer clothes that cost more than most people's yearly salary, Miriam took public buses and ate at roadside mama put joints, always saying she wanted to know how real people lived. Her father worried constantly, sending bodyguard to follow her from a distance, but Miriam had a gift for spotting them and giving them the slip. She was stubborn like that, beautiful, intelligent, with skin the color of rich cocoa and eyes that saw through pretense and straight into people's souls. That's how she found Tunde on a sweltering afternoon in Ikeja, his small mechanic workshop tucked between a provision store and a vulcanizer shop, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Her father's driver had recommended the place when her car developed a strange knocking sound, and against his protests, Miriam insisted on going herself to see this mechanic everyone called Magic Hands. Tunde was under a Toyota Camry when she arrived, his muscular arms streaked with grease, sweat rolling down his dark forehead as he worked. When he finally emerged and saw her standing there in her simple jeans and white shirt, he froze, not because he recognized her wealth, but because her smile made his heart forget how to beat properly. "They say you're good with engines," Miriam said, and Tunde, usually confident with customers, found himself stammering like a schoolboy. That afternoon stretched into evening as Tunde fixed her car, and their conversation flowed like old friends reuniting, talking about everything from Nigerian politics to their favorite jollof rice spots. 3 months later, they were dating, and Miriam's family was in uproar. A mechanic, her mother shrieked during a family dinner that turned into a battlefield, her voice echoing through their Koi mansion. "You went to the best schools in Nigeria and abroad, and you want to marry a man who smells like engine oil." Chief Okonkwo sat quietly, watching his daughter's face, seeing the determination that reminded him of himself decades ago. Her cousins called her crazy, said Tunde was obviously a gold digger who would drain her dry and disappear. But Miriam defended him with a fire that silenced the room. "Tunde doesn't even know who my father is. He loves me for me, not for what I can buy him." And it was true. Tunde had no idea he was dating a billionaire's daughter until the day Miriam took him to meet her family, and his jaw nearly hit the floor when he saw the mansion with its gates that looked like they guarded a presidential villa. The wedding happened 6 months later, a grand affair that had society pages buzzing, and Miriam immediately set about changing Tunde's life. She started subtly, using her father's connections to get Tunde contracts with major companies who needed fleet maintenance, introducing him to importers who could get genuine spare parts at wholesale prices that made his competitors weep with envy. Within 2 years, Tunde's automobile services had expanded from that tiny Ikeja workshop to 5 locations across Lagos, Port Harcourt, and Abuja, employing over 50 people and servicing some of the biggest corporate fleets in Nigeria. Tunde worked hard, no doubt. His skill was real, His business sense sharp, but Miriam's quiet support opened doors that would have remained locked for decades otherwise. They lived well, bought a house in Lekki Phase 1, drove matching Range Rovers, and people who once looked down on Tunde now called him Ogo with respect and envy. But success, as Miriam would later learn, doesn't just reveal character. Sometimes it changes it completely. Tunde began arriving home later, his explanations vaguer, his patience with Miriam shorter, especially after she started feeling tired all the time, her body betraying her in ways neither of them understood yet. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday that felt like the world stopped spinning. Stage 3 kidney disease, aggressive and brutal, requiring immediate treatment that would cost millions of naira and months of intensive care. Will Miriam survive this deadly disease, or will Tunde's abandonment seal her fate? And what will Chief Okonkwo do when he discovers his daughter has been left to die alone? Make sure you're subscribed because next chapter will blow your mind. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me if you think Tunde deserves what's coming to him. Chief Okonkwo received a call at 2 a.m., his personal phone vibrating on the nightstand with a persistence that pulled him from sleep. "So, it's about Miriam," his head of security said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She's alone at St. Nicholas Hospital. Her husband, he left her there, so he took his things and left with another woman while your daughter was unconscious." The old man didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't break anything. He simply stood up, dressed in silence while his wife watched with tears streaming down her face, and made 3 phone calls that would mobilize resources most people couldn't imagine. By 4 a.m., Miriam was being airlifted by private medical jet to a specialized facility in Germany, still unconscious, unaware that her husband had abandoned his dying sick wife or that her father was moving heaven and earth to save her life while planning a very quiet, very thorough form of revenge against a man who had betrayed his only daughter. Meanwhile, Tunde was tangled in hotel sheets with Chidera, his mistress of 8 months, a woman he'd met at a business conference who had bodies that stopped traffic and ambitions that made his seem small. "You did the right thing," Chidera whispered, running her manicured nails down his chest. "That woman was draining you, Tunde. All those hospital bills, the medical treatments, the stress, you deserve better. You deserve to enjoy the life you built." She was careful not to mention that Miriam had built that life with him, that without Miriam's connections, Tunde would still be fixing Danfo buses in Ikija. Chidera had a gift for rewriting history, for making Tunde believe that his success was his alone, that Miriam had been lucky to have him rather than the other way around. "I feel bad, though," Tunde admitted, staring at the ceiling. "Maybe I should have stayed until—" Chidera cut him off with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Until what? Until she died and tied you down with guilt forever? Baby, life is for the living. Miriam would want you to be happy." The lies tasted sweet going down, and Tunde swallowed them whole. He returned to work on Monday, telling his employees that Miriam had gone abroad for treatment and would be fine, his voice so confident that no one questioned him. But guilt is a funny way of eating people from the inside, and Tunde started drinking more. Hennessy at lunch, star beer in the evenings, anything to silence a voice in his head that kept showing him Miriam's unconscious face. Chidera moved into the Lekki house within a week, redecorating Miriam's space with an efficiency that felt almost cruel, removing photographs and replacing them with abstract art that had no memory attached. "This is our fresh start," she announced, twirling in the living room. Tunde's friends noticed a change, especially Amaka, his best friend since their apprentice days, who cornered him at the office one afternoon with eyes full of judgment and disappointment. "Guy, wedding day happened?" Amaka asked in pidgin, his voice low but fierce. "You just come and leave your wife we sick for hospital? The same woman we help you build all this." He gestured around the fancy office with its leather chairs and mahogany desk. Tunde's face hardened, shame transforming instantly into defensive anger, the way drowning men lash out at rescuers. "You don't understand," Tunde snapped. "You're not the one spending millions every week on treatments that weren't even working. Miriam was dying. Amaka, what was I supposed to do? Die with her?" Amaka stared at his friend like he was looking at a stranger wearing Tunde's face. "You were supposed to love her," he said quietly. "That's what you promised. For better or worse, ABI you don't forget." The confrontation ended with Tunde ordering Amaka out of his office, severing a friendship that had survived poverty, betrayal by other friends, and 15 years of brotherhood, all sacrificed on the altar of Tunde's guilt and Chitera's manipulation. But Chitera wasn't just a homewrecker looking for a comfortable life. She was a professional, a woman who had studied Tunde for months before making her move, identifying him as a man whose ego had grown faster than his wisdom. While Tunde thought they were building a future together, Chitera was systematically draining his accounts, transferring money to offshore accounts he didn't know existed, forging his signature on documents that signed away properties, setting up her exit strategy with the precision of a bank robber casing a vault. She convinced him to make her a signatory on his business accounts. "So I can help you. Baby, you work so hard." And Tunde, drunk on sex and the illusion of a fresh start, signed everything she put in front of him. His accountant tried to warn him, showing him statements with unexplained withdrawals. But Tunde fired a man on the spot, accusing him of trying to cause trouble in his relationship. What Tunde didn't know was that halfway across the world, in a pristine German hospital, Miriam was waking up. Her eyes opened slowly, the fluorescent lights too bright, machines beeping steadily around her like a technological orchestra. A white doctor with kind eyes smiled down at her, speaking English with a thick German accent. "Welcome back, Mrs. Tunde. You gave us quite a scare, but you're going to be fine now." Miriam's first word was her husband's name, slurred and desperate. "Tunde." The doctor's smile faltered slightly before a nurse, a Nigerian woman her father had specifically hired, stepped forward and took Miriam's hand. "Your father is on his way," she said gently, avoiding the question. "Just rest now. You're safe." But Miriam wasn't a fool, and the carefully neutral expressions told her everything. Tunde wasn't coming because Tunde hadn't come. In that sterile room thousands of miles from home, Miriam finally understood that her husband had abandoned his dying sick wife, and the pain of that betrayal hurt worse than the disease that had nearly killed her. Will Miriam ever forgive the man who left her to die alone? And does Tunde have any idea what's waiting for him back in Nigeria? The answer will shock you. Don't forget to like this video and comment below what you think Miriam should do when she gets back. Next chapter is coming, and trust me, you won't believe what happens next. 18 months after abandoning Miriam in that hospital, Tunde stood in the ruins of his once thriving business, staring at the locked gates of his main workshop with a kind of disbelief that comes when your entire world collapses in slow motion. The nightmare had started 6 months earlier when he woke up to find Chitera gone, not just out for a morning walk gone, but vanished with Narion gone, leaving behind only a lipstick-stained note that read, "Thanks for everything, baby. You were fun while it lasted." His bank accounts were empty, his business accounts drained, his properties somehow signed over to shell companies that his lawyers couldn't trace, and Tunde finally understood with brutal clarity that he'd been played like a cheap guitar by a woman who had studied him the way scientists study viruses. But financial devastation was just the opening act. His suppliers started demanding immediate payment for debts Chitera had accumulated in his name. His landlord evicted him when he couldn't pay rent, and his employees abandoned ship when paychecks bounced, spreading word throughout Lagos that Tunde's automobile services were finished, done, dead in the water. The fall from grace was spectacular and public in a way that made Tunde wish for invisibility. Men who had called him ogre and laughed at his jokes now crossed the street to avoid him. Former friends suddenly didn't recognize his number when he called begging for loans, and the few relatives who answered his pleas did so with that carefully polite pity that feels like acid on your pride. Amaka, the best friend he'd thrown out of his office, offered help once, showing up at the cramped room Tunde now rented and mushing with groceries and an envelope of cash. But Tunde's shame transformed into pride's uglier cousin, resentment. "I don't need your pity," Tunde snarled, even as his stomach growled loud enough to be heard across the room. Amaka set the groceries down anyway, shook his head with infinite sadness, and left without another word, finally accepting that his friend had become someone beyond saving. Tunde ate those groceries that night, crying while swallowing gari that tasted like humiliation, understanding too late that pride is a luxury only the comfortable can afford. His mother's calls became interrogations laced with disappointment. "Tunde, what happened to you? We heard Miriam died, but people are saying you abandoned her. Is it true? How could you do such a thing after everything that girl did for you?" The lies became harder to maintain, partly because Tunde himself wasn't sure what the truth was anymore. Had he abandoned his dying sick wife, or had he made a practical decision that just looked bad in hindsight? His mind performed gymnastics to justify actions his heart knew were indefensible, and the internal conflict manifested as insomnia that left him staring at water-stained ceilings until sunrise, replaying moments he could never take back. The worst part wasn't the poverty, though that was brutal enough, but the mirror, which showed him a man he didn't recognize, gaunt, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that smelled like desperation no matter how many times he washed them in the communal tap behind his building. 6 months into his personal apocalypse, Tunde heard about a foundation that provided free meals to the destitute. No questions asked, no judgment, just hot food and basic dignity served daily in a compound off Adolo Deku Street in Victoria Island. Pride fought hunger for 3 weeks before hunger won, and Tunde found himself joining the line of broken people outside Hope Restored Foundation on a humid Tuesday afternoon, his head down, praying he wouldn't see anyone he knew. The compound was surprisingly beautiful, clean, painted in warm yellows and greens, with workers who treated everyone with respect that felt revolutionary after months of contempt. Tunde collected his plate of jollof rice and chicken, actual chicken, not the bone scraps he'd been eating, and found a seat under a tree, shoveling food into his mouth so fast he barely tasted it, focused only on filling the empty space inside that had nothing to do with hunger. "Tunde?" The voice came from behind him, soft but unmistakable, and Tunde's blood turned to ice in his veins. He turned slowly, the way people do in nightmares when they know the monster's right behind them, and there she stood, Miriam, his wife, the woman he'd left to die alone in a hospital bed, except she wasn't dying at all. She was radiant, glowing with health, her skin clear and smooth, her body filled out in all the places illness had hollowed, wearing a simple blue dress that probably cost more than his entire wardrobe now, and her eyes, those eyes that used to look at him with love, now held something far more complex, recognition, pain, and a strength that hadn't been there before. Tunde's plate crashed to the ground, ceramics shattering like his composure, and before he could stop himself, before pride or shame could intervene, his knees buckled and he collapsed at her feet, tears streaming down his face, words pouring out in a desperate flood. "Miriam, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. Please forgive me. Please, I made a mistake, the biggest mistake of my life." The entire compound had gone silent, workers and recipients alike frozen in place, watching this drama unfold like a scene from a Nollywood movie playing out in real time. Miriam looked down at the man who had been her husband, the man she'd loved enough to defy her family and rebuild from nothing, the man who had abandoned his dying sick wife when she needed him most, and felt a complicated tangle of emotions. Pity, residual love fighting against bitter betrayal, anger at what he'd done, and underneath it all, a profound sadness for what they'd lost. "Stand up, Tunde," she said quietly, and when he looked up with hope blazing in his eyes, she continued in a voice that remained gentle but carried finality like a judge's gavel. "Stand up. You don't need to kneel. I forgave you a long time ago, forgave you for me, so I could move forward without the poison of hatred eating me alive. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it definitely doesn't mean going back." The hope in Tunde's eyes died right there, and what came next would change everything. But before we get to that earth-shattering revelation, I need you to smash that like button if you're as shocked as Tunde right now, and drop a comment telling me whether Miriam is being too harsh or if Tunde is getting exactly what he deserves. Next chapter is going to reveal secrets that will make your jaw drop. Miriam didn't walk away immediately after a devastating declaration. Instead, she gestured for Tunde to sit at a nearby table, and despite his trembling legs and shattered pride, he obeyed like a schoolboy called to the headmaster's office. The other people in the compound gradually returned to their meals, though Tunde could feel their eyes on him, their whispers spreading like wildfire. "That's the ogre's husband, the one who abandoned her. Can you imagine? Karma is real, oh." Miriam sat across from him with a careful distance of someone approaching a wounded animal that might still bite, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 20 months of survival, transformation, and painful growth. "I want you to understand something. Tunde, when you left me in that hospital, I was unconscious, but some part of me knew, felt you leaving, felt that moment when you chose yourself over us. And when I woke up in Germany 3 days later and my father told me what you'd done, I wanted to die. Not from the kidney disease, but from the heartbreak, because a man I'd loved enough to fight my family for had proven everyone right about you." The words hit Tunde like physical blows, each sentence an indictment he couldn't defend against because it was simply true. But then something changed, Miriam continued, her eyes distant as she revisited memories that had reshaped her. I was lying in that hospital bed feeling sorry for myself, and my father, you remember my father, the man you used to make jokes about being too serious, he sat beside me every single day for 2 months. And one afternoon he told me something I'll never forget. He said, Miriam, that boy didn't break you. He revealed who he was when tested, and now you know. But you get to decide if this betrayal defines your story or just becomes a painful chapter you survived. Miriam's fingers traced patterns on the plastic table as she spoke, and Tunde noticed details he'd been too panicked to register earlier. The expensive watch on her wrist, the subtle makeup that enhanced rather than masked her natural beauty, the confidence that radiated from her like heat from burning coal. This wasn't the woman he'd married. This was someone who'd walked through fire and emerged as steel. So I chose to survive, Miriam said, her voice strengthening. I went through treatments that felt like torture, dialysis that made me wish for death some days, and eventually a kidney transplant that my father moved mountains to arrange. I learned German because I was bored lying in bed, started reading books on business and management because I finally had time, and slowly rebuilt myself piece by piece. Not for you, not for anyone else, but for me. She paused, letting Tunde absorb this, watching emotions play across his face like clouds across the sun. Shame, regret, loss, and something that looked dangerously close to renewed hope. When I came back to Nigeria 6 months ago, healthy and alive, I could have come straight to you, could have confronted you, cursed you out, made your life hell the way you deserve. But I didn't, because I realized something important. You weren't worth that energy. Instead, I took the settlement my father gave me. He'd already dissolved our marriage on grounds of abandonment while I was abroad, and I started this foundation. Tunde's eyes widened as the implication sank in. Miriam on hope-restored foundation, the place currently keeping him alive with free meals, meaning he'd been surviving on his ex-wife's charity without knowing it. The humiliation was exquisite, perfect, almost poetic in its completeness, and somewhere in the back of Tunde's mind, a voice whispered that he deserved every burning second of the shame. We feed about 200 people daily, Miriam explained, her tone shifting to professional efficiency, as if discussing a business report rather than her personal revenge served cold and charitable. Provide job training, help people get back on their feet. It's my way of making sure that what happened to me, being abandoned when vulnerable, never happens to anyone else if I can help it. Ironic, isn't it, that you'd end up here, eating food paid for by the woman you threw away like garbage. Her words weren't delivered with venom, but with a matter-of-fact honesty that hurt worse than any insult could have. Miriam, please. Tunde started, but she held up one hand, silencing him with a gesture that reminded him painfully of her father, of the power and authority he'd forgotten ran in her blood. I'm not finished, she said, and steel entered her voice. You're going to keep coming here. Tunde, you're going to eat these meals, accept this help, because I'm not cruel enough to let you starve regardless of what you did. But every time you come through that gate, I want you to remember what you had and what you threw away. I want you to understand that the same woman you abandoned because she was too much trouble is now the reason you're surviving at all. She stood up then, smoothing her dress, preparing to leave, and Tunde felt panic rising in his chest like floodwater, the desperate certainty that if she walked away now, he'd lose something he couldn't even name. Is there any chance? He began, but Miriam cut him off with a laugh that held no humor, only profound weariness with a question she'd probably anticipated. Any chance of what, Tunde? Of us getting back together? Of me rescuing you again, fixing your life the way I did before? She shook her head slowly, and Tunde saw finality in her eyes that made his stomach drop. I learned something important these past 2 years. I can't save people who don't value what I give them. You proved that when you abandoned your dying sick wife the moment she became inconvenient. So no, there's no chance. But here's what I will do. And then Miriam revealed something that would change everything Tunde thought he understood about revenge, forgiveness, and the complicated space between them. But you're going to have to wait for next chapter to find out what Miriam offers Tunde, because this cliffhanger is too good to spoil. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the final chapter is going to leave you speechless. Comment justice if you think Miriam is handling this perfectly, or mercy if you think she should give Tunde another chance. You won't believe how this story ends. Miriam's offer came like sunlight through prison bars, unexpected, complicated, and carrying conditions that would require Tunde to become someone he'd never been before. "I'm going to give you a job," she said, and Tunde's heart leaped before she continued with words that crashed his hopes back to earth. "Not as my husband, not as anything close to what we were, but as a mechanic in the training program I run for young people who want to learn automotive skills. You'll teach 3 days a week, earn a modest salary that'll help you get back on your feet. And in exchange, you'll show these young men and women what real skill looks like, the skill you had before success made you forget where you came from." The terms were generous and humiliating in equal measure, forcing Tunde to confront the reality that his ex-wife was now his employer, his benefactor, and the person holding his survival in her hands. "Why would you do this?" Tunde asked, his voice breaking. "After everything I did, why help me at all?" Miriam's expression softened slightly, revealing the woman who'd once loved him beneath the armor she'd built. "Because despite everything, I remember the man you used to be," Miriam answered quietly. "The humble mechanic in Ikija who treated every car like it mattered, who saved money to send his younger siblings to school, who cried when we got married because he couldn't believe someone like me could love someone like him." The first month working at Hope Restored Foundation was its own special kind of torture, waking up at 5 a.m. to catch buses from Mushin to Victoria Island, arriving at a compound where people still whispered and pointed, teaching young apprentices who knew his story and looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt that he'd earned every bit of. But Tunde showed up every single day, on time, sober, determined to prove something he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. The work itself was salvation, his hands remembering the language of engines and metal, his mind focusing on diagnosis and repair rather than regret and shame, his voice finding patience he'd forgotten he possessed as he guided teenagers through techniques that had taken him years to master. Some days he'd catch glimpses of Miriam moving through the compound, always professional, always kind to everyone, and occasionally their eyes would meet across the space and she'd nod, just a simple acknowledgement that he existed, that he was doing the work, and somehow those nods meant more than all the praise he'd received when he was wealthy and successful. Then one afternoon, Amaka, yes, that Amaka, Tunde's former best friend, appeared at the workshop, and Tunde watched in stunned silence as Amaka kissed Miriam's cheek with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there, who'd chosen a side when their friendship fractured, and Tunde understood he'd lost not just his wife but his best friend to his own terrible choices. 3 months into his new life, something unexpected happened during a staff meeting where Miriam was presenting expansion plans for the foundation. Tunde had been invited because the automotive training program was growing faster than anticipated, and his input was needed on equipment and space requirements. He sat in the back of the room, still uncomfortable with his dual role as both beneficiary and employee, when a young man named David, one of his best students, stood up during the Q&A session and said something that made the entire room go quiet. "I just want to say that Mr. Tunde is the best teacher I've ever had. He doesn't just show us how to fix cars. He tells us stories about his own mistakes, about how he lost everything by making bad choices, and he makes sure we understand that skill without character is useless. Here's the reason I'm staying in school now instead of running streets." The room erupted in applause, and Tunde felt tears threatening as he looked up to find Miriam watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Not love, not anymore, but something like respect, like recognition of the man she'd once believed him might still be somewhere inside the broken person he'd become. After the meeting, Miriam approached him in the parking lot where he was waiting for his bus, and for the first time in 6 months, she initiated a conversation that wasn't about work schedules or training supplies, saying words that would change the trajectory of his healing. "David's right, you know," Miriam said, leaning against her car, a modest Toyota, not the Range Rover they'd shared in their previous life. "You're good at this, at teaching. The students love you because you're real with them. Don't pretend to be perfect." Tunde shrugged, uncomfortable with praise he still didn't feel he deserved. "I'm just trying to make sure they don't make my mistakes," he said quietly. "And Miriam, I want you to know, I'm seeing a therapist now, using part of my salary to work through why I did what I did, why I let that woman manipulate me, why I was so willing to throw away everything good in my life when I abandoned my dying sick wife." Miriam's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise and approval flickering across her face, because therapy wasn't common in their circles, wasn't something Nigerian men traditionally embraced. "That's real growth, Tunde," she said, her voice softening. "Can I ask you something?" Tunde ventured. "That doctor you're seeing, the one from Germany, are you happy?" It was painful to ask, but he needed to know. Miriam's smile was small but genuine. "I'm getting there. He's patient, understanding, doesn't push me. It's different from what we had, slower, safer. But yes, I think I'm happy, or at least learning how to be again." The finality should have crushed him, but instead brought unexpected peace, the kind that comes when you accept consequences you can't change and focus on who you can become. 1 year later, Tunde stood at the opening ceremony of the Foundation's new automotive training center, watching Miriam cut the ribbon while her father, Chief Okonkwo, who had eventually forgiven Tunde enough to acknowledge his existence, looked on with pride. Tunde had been promoted to head instructor, had moved into a better apartment, had reconnected with his mother and siblings who had cautiously welcomed him back, and had even started dating a nurse who knew his whole story and somehow saw potential in his battered soul. He'd never get Miriam back. That door was closed and locked, and honestly, as his therapist helped him understand, trying to reclaim that relationship would be selfish rather than loving. But he had something arguably more valuable. A second chance to be the person he should have been all along, a purpose that extended beyond personal success to helping others avoid his mistakes, and the hard-won knowledge that wealth means nothing if you're poor in character. As the ceremony ended and people mingled, Amaka, who'd slowly, carefully rebuilt a friendship with Tunde based on new terms and old affection, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You did good, guy. Not with Miriam, that one you mess up proper. But with yourself, you're doing the work." And in the end, that had to be enough, because some mistakes don't get erased or rewound. They just become the foundation you build better choices on, one painful, humble, transformed day at a time. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment what lesson you're taking from Tunde and Miriam's journey. Share this with someone who needs to hear that consequences are real, but so is redemption. S.